Laughter. That's how it started. Not a confrontation, not an insult, not a challenge thrown across a crowded room. Laughter. Deep, rolling, room-filling laughter from a voice so low it vibrated the ice cubes in 40 cocktail glasses. The kind of laughter that makes strangers smile before they know the joke. The kind of laughter that comes from a chest cavity the size of a bass drum and fills a room the way weather fills a valley. Then silence. Total silence. 40 people in a living room in the Hollywood Hills, and nobody was breathing. Nobody was reaching for a drink. Nobody was finishing a sentence. Every pair of eyes in the room was locked on the same 2-foot space between two men who had no business standing that close to each other. A hand went up. A hand came down. It landed on the head of the smallest man in the room. 2 seconds later, the largest man in the room was staring at his own fingers. They had stopped working. What happened in that living room in October of 1969 lasted less than 3 seconds. The conversation that followed lasted until 2 a.m. Only one of those things involved violence. The other involved something far more dangerous. Understanding. The house sat on a ridge above Mulholland Drive in the Hollywood Hills, cantilevered over the slope like a white fist gripping the edge of the earth. Mid-century modern, glass and steel, and poured concrete. The architect had designed the living room with floor-to-ceiling windows on the south wall so that the entire grid of Los Angeles spread below like a circuit board, 1,000,000 amber lights running in parallel lines from the hills to the Pacific Ocean, 14 miles away. On clear nights you could see the dark curve of the Santa Monica Bay and the faint pulse of the Palos Verdes lighthouse blinking every 10 seconds at the southern edge of the world. This was a Saturday night in October 1969. The air was warm and dry, carrying the faint electrical smell of chaparral from the canyons and the chemical sweetness of chlorine from the kidney-shaped pool, glowing turquoise on the terrace. The host was a producer, mid-50s, silver hair, tan the color of expensive luggage. The kind of man who had 3 phones in his house and used all of them simultaneously. He threw parties every other Saturday, not because he was generous, because parties were infrastructure. In Hollywood in 1969, a living room was a conference room. A cocktail was a contract. A handshake by the pool was worth more than a meeting at the studio. 40 to 50 guests moved through the house, men in sport coats and turtlenecks, their hair longer than it would have been 2 years earlier, sideburns thickening toward the jawline as the decade pushed toward its end. Women in cocktail dresses with oversized sunglasses pushed up into their hair, holding champagne flutes like scepters. Cigarette smoke layered the air at chest height, drifting through the living room in slow blue currents that caught the light from the pool below. On the built-in stereo, Miles Davis played In a Silent Way, the album released that same year, a long, ambient wash of trumpet and electric piano that sounded less like music and more like the room thinking. The guest list included the usual constellation: 2 actors between projects, a director in pre-production, an agent who represented athletes and was responsible for most of the non-Hollywood faces in the room, 3 studio executives who smiled too wide and stood too close, a retired football player who transitioned into television commentary, a singer whose last album had gone gold, and a woman who nobody could identify but who seemed to know everyone. And Bruce Lee. He arrived at 8:45 p.m. He parked a black Porsche 356C at the bottom of the driveway and walked up the flagstone path to the front door. He was 29 years old, 5 feet, 7 inches, 135 pounds. He wore a black silk shirt, open one button at the collar, tucked into black slacks with a thin leather belt. Black leather shoes, no jewelry, no watch. His hair was cut short and combed back. He carried nothing, no wallet in his back pocket, no keys visible. He moved up the path like a man who kept everything he needed inside his own body. He looked at first glance like the least significant person who had walked through that door all night. At second glance, something changed. His forearms were visible below sleeves he'd rolled to the midpoint of each arm, and the forearms were what made people look twice. They were not large. Bruce Lee's forearms would not have impressed a bodybuilder or a longshoreman or anyone who measured power by circumference. They were lean, roped, and visibly alive. Veins ran across them in raised ridges like rivers on a topographic map. Tendons moved independently beneath the skin. When his fingers shifted, a constant subtle motion, as if the forearms were engines idling at low speed, ready to accelerate without notice. The skin was tight over the muscle, No fat, no softness, every fiber visible, every cable traceable from wrist to elbow. A woman near the bar watched him walk in and later told the host, his arms looked like they were built by a watchmaker. She was closer to the truth than she knew. In October 1969, Bruce Lee was famous enough to be invited to this party and anonymous enough to stand in the corner without being interrupted. The Green Hornet had been cancelled 2 years earlier. He had played Kato, the masked chauffeur and sidekick, with a physical precision that had made him a cult figure in certain circles, and a footnote in others. The show lasted 1 season. Kato lasted longer. People remembered the sidekick more than the hero. They remembered the way he moved, fast, angular, with a coiled economy that made the lead actor look like he was running through water. But one cancelled television season does not make a career in Hollywood, and Bruce Lee in 1969 was a man between identities. He taught martial arts privately. His students included Steve McQueen, James Coburn, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and several screenwriters who were more interested in philosophy than punching. He was developing a new martial art, Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist, that rejected traditional forms and embraced direct, efficient, principle-based combat. He was writing, thinking, training 14 hours a day, waiting for something that hadn't arrived yet. He was 4 years from Enter the Dragon, 4 years from becoming the most famous martial artist in human history, 4 years from a poster on every wall in every dojo on every continent, 4 years from death. None of that had happened yet. On this Saturday night, Bruce Lee was the man people pointed to at dinner parties and said, "That's the martial arts guy who trained McQueen." If McQueen was in the room, people looked at McQueen. If McQueen was not in the room, people looked past Bruce entirely. He entered the party and moved through it, the way he moved through every room, perimeter first, then interior. It was not a social habit, it was a combat habit. He read the room the way a general reads terrain. Where were the exits? Where was the natural choke point? Which guests were standing near hard surfaces that could become weapons if a chair was thrown or a bottle was broken? He didn't expect violence at a Hollywood party. He prepared for it the way he prepared for weather. Not because rain was likely, because an umbrella weighs nothing. He reached the bar. He asked for water. The bartender, who had been pouring bourbon and champagne for 3 hours, paused. "Just water?" Bruce nodded. The bartender poured a glass from a crystal pitcher with a lemon wheel floating on top. Bruce took it and moved to the large window on the south wall. He stood there, the city lights below, the pool light reflected on the ceiling above, Miles Davis drifting through the smoke. He watched the room the way a man watches a river from a bridge, studying the currents, the eddies, the places where the water bunches and accelerates, the places where it goes still. Bruce Lee was the smallest man at the party. He was also the most dangerous human being within a 4-mile radius of that house. Nobody in the room knew the second fact. Everybody noticed the first. At 9:15 p.m., the room changed. It didn't change because of a sound. It changed because of a shift, a gravitational disturbance. The way a pond changes when a large stone is dropped in at one end, the water doesn't just move at the point of impact, it moves everywhere. The entire surface adjusts. People near the foyer turned and looked up. Not looked over, looked up. Conversations paused mid-word. A woman holding a champagne flute let it tilt 15 degrees without noticing. A man telling a story about a yacht forgot his next sentence and never found it. Someone had walked through the front door who reshaped the geometry of the room by standing in it. He ducked. The foyer archway was 6 feet 8 inches high. The man who entered it was not. He tilted his head forward and to the left, a motion so practiced and fluid that it was clearly something he did 50 times a day, entering cars, entering restaurants, entering elevators, entering any space designed for human beings of normal dimensions. He ducked the way other people breathed, without thinking, because thinking about it would mean thinking about the fact that the world was not built for him, and thinking about that every day for 33 years would drive a man insane. He straightened on the other side of the archway, and the room recalibrated. His head was 18 inches above every other head in the room. 18 inches, 1.5 feet of empty air between the top of the tallest guest's skull and the bottom of this man's chin. His shoulders were wider than the archway had appeared to allow. Later, 2 guests independently described the same illusion. It looked like the doorframe flexed outward to let him through. His arms hung at his sides, and the arms were long, impossibly long. the fingertips reaching past his mid-thigh, each hand large enough to wrap around a cantaloupe and hide it completely. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, custom. No off-the-rack suit had ever fit this frame, and no off-the-rack suit ever would. The fabric draped over his shoulders like a flag over a monument. A gold watch sat on his left wrist, and the wrist itself was the circumference of a normal man's ankle. Thick, round, ribbed with tendons, the watch band clearly a custom length. His cufflinks were small, almost delicate against the enormous shirt cuffs, purple and gold. The colours were specific. The colours meant something. Not everyone in the room would have recognized the reference, but anyone who followed professional basketball would have felt a pulse of recognition. His shoes were size 16. They hit the marble foyer floor with a sound like a slow, confident drum. His face was angular, handsome, with cheekbones that cast their own shadows in the overhead light. His smile arrived before he spoke, the way dawn arrives before the sun, a gradual brightening that started at the corners of his mouth and spread outward until his entire face was lit by it. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, scanning the room with the quick lateral movements of a man accustomed to reading a basketball court, tracking the positions of 10 bodies simultaneously, calculating distances and angles and velocities and the spaces between them. His voice, when he spoke, did not come from his throat. It came from a deeper place, his chest, his diaphragm, maybe his foundation. It was a baritone that resonated at a frequency you didn't just hear. You felt it. People standing within 5 feet of him reported feeling his voice in their sternum, in the bones of their face, like standing near a church organ during a low note. It was a voice built for a body that was built for dominance, and it filled whatever room it entered, the way his frame filled whatever doorway he walked through. "The big man is here," the host called from across the room, raising a glass. The room responded. People moved toward him, not all of them. Not consciously, but the way iron filings move toward a magnet, gradually, inevitably, as if the space around him had a lower pressure, and everything nearby was being drawn in to equalize. Women especially. He was magnetic in a way that had nothing to do with cologne or conversation. It was physics. He was the largest object in the room, and large objects bend the space around them. He worked the room. Every circle he joined, he dominated, not through volume or aggression, but through the sheer geometry of his presence. He told stories with his hands, and his hands moved through the air like slow satellites orbiting his body. He flirted with a precision that suggested years of practice and thousands of repetitions. He laughed, and the laughter was a geological event. It started somewhere below his belt, traveled upward through his torso like magma through a volcanic column, and erupted from his mouth with a force that made people 12 feet away grin involuntarily, as if the sound waves were pushing the muscles of their faces into smiles. Bruce watched from the window. He didn't move toward the man. He didn't move away. He held his glass of water and studied the way the tall man carried his weight. Light for his size, balanced on the balls of his feet, despite being 275 pounds, his center of gravity sat lower than it should have for someone that height, a sign of hip flexibility and core strength that most men over 6'5" never develop, because their bodies compensate for height with stiffness. This man hadn't compensated. This man had trained. This man was not just tall, he was an athlete at the highest level, conditioned to move his 275 pounds with a speed and coordination that violated the expectations his height created. Bruce noticed one more thing: the man's hands. They were not just large, they were expressive. They opened and closed with an ease that suggested extraordinary grip strength, the kind of strength that comes not from squeezing exercises, but from years of catching, palming, controlling and releasing spherical objects at speed. His fingers spread wide when he gestured and came together when he pointed. The span of his open hand was approximately 11 inches. Bruce measured it from across the room, using the width of a cocktail glass as a reference. 11 inches. A hand that size could wrap around a human skull. The room had a new center of gravity. It was 7 feet 1 inch tall, weighed 275 pounds, and was currently telling a joke that had 12 people crying with laughter. Bruce Lee stood at the window and measured the distance between them. 18 feet across the room, 18 inches of height difference, 140 pounds of weight difference. Bruce had faced worse odds, but never at a cocktail party. He sipped his water. He waited. At 9:50 p.m., the geometry of the party did what party geometry always does. It shifted. Groups broke apart and reformed. Conversations migrated. The tall man's circle of admirers drifted across the living room like a slow weather system, moving from the bar toward the terrace doors and then back toward the center of the room. By 9:48, the circle had drifted to within 10 feet of the window where Bruce stood. By 9:50, the tall man himself was backing toward Bruce while telling a story about a road trip, his massive hands painting the air with gestures, his audience rapt. Someone in the group, the sports agent, the one who had invited both men, noticed Bruce standing by the window and seized the opportunity the way agents seize everything, immediately and without subtlety. "Hey, big man, have you met Bruce? He's the martial arts guy. Trained McQueen." The tall man turned. He turned the way an aircraft carrier turns. Not quickly, but with an authority that suggested the entire ocean would wait. He looked down, 18 inches down. His eyes found Bruce's face, and the smile arrived. The big, easy, sunrise smile of a man who had been the tallest person in every room since he was 14 years old, and who had long ago learned that his height was both his identity and his best opening line. He didn't need to say anything interesting. He just needed to stand there. His body was the conversation. He extended his right hand downward, not rudely. The angle was simply what physics required. His hand traveled from his waist level to Bruce's chest level, a downward diagonal that covered nearly 2 feet of vertical space. Bruce took the hand. The size difference was anatomically absurd. Bruce's hand disappeared inside the tall man's palm, the way a child's hand disappears inside a baseball glove. The tall man's fingers wrapped around Bruce's hand and overlapped on the other side. His thumb alone covered Bruce's entire row of knuckles. It wasn't a handshake, it was an engulfment. But Bruce felt something inside that enormous grip. The tall man didn't squeeze, he didn't need to. The hand itself was the statement. But Bruce's fingers, those watchmaker forearm fingers, pressed into the tall man's palm and read it the way a safecracker reads a lock. The calluses were specific, thick pads on the fingertips and the heel of the palm, abrasion patterns on the index and middle fingers that suggested years of spinning a round object on those 2 points. The skin was dry, tough, maintained. This was not a hand that signed documents. This was a hand that worked. "Dan Inosanto talks about you," the tall man said. His voice, from 18 inches above, felt like it was arriving from a higher altitude, like weather coming down from a mountain. "Says you're the fastest man he's ever seen." "Dan exaggerates," Bruce said, the same line he gave everyone, the humble deflection that cost nothing and revealed nothing. "He said you'd say that too." The circle laughed. Bruce didn't. He released the handshake and placed both hands behind his back. His feet shifted 2 inches apart. His weight settled evenly. It was an almost invisible adjustment, but it was the adjustment of a man who had moved from social mode to assessment mode. His body was now balanced. He could move in any direction in under a quarter of a second. He didn't expect to need to. He prepared anyway. The conversation floated through pleasantries. "What do you do? Where did you train? How long have you been in Los Angeles?" The tall man was friendly, curious, not hostile. He asked genuine questions and listened to the answers with the focus of a man who was accustomed to people talking at him rather than with him. Bruce's answers were short, precise, delivered without embellishment. "I teach people how to use their bodies more efficiently." The tall man grinned. "Brother, I've been using my body efficiently for 13 years and getting paid very well for it." The circle laughed again. Then someone asked the question. It came from a man on the edge of the circle, one of the studio executives, 3 bourbons deep. His judgment loosened to the point where discretion had left the building. He looked at Bruce, then up at the tall man, then back at Bruce, and said, "Bruce, honestly, could you take someone that big?" The circle went quiet. Not silent. Quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when a room collectively recognizes that a line has been approached, and the next 3 seconds will determine whether it gets crossed. Bruce sipped his water. He didn't answer. The tall man looked down at Bruce. The smile was still there, but something behind it had shifted. A new curiosity, not aggressive, playful. The curiosity of a man who has been unchallenged for so long that the possibility of a challenge is not threatening, it's entertaining. He raised his right hand, slowly, casually, the way a man reaches for a glass on a high shelf. His arm extended upward and outward, elbow bending slightly, and his hand, that 11-inch basketball palming hand, descended toward the top of Bruce Lee's head and landed. His palm settled onto Bruce's skull the way it settled onto a basketball. With total, relaxed authority, his fingers draped past Bruce's temples. His thumb rested behind Bruce's right ear. The heel of his palm sat on the crown. He applied no pressure. He didn't push. He didn't grip. He simply rested his hand there, the way a man rests his arm on a mantelpiece or the back of a chair, except Bruce Lee's head was the armrest. The room reacted in layers. First layer, laughter. Immediate, nervous. The kind of laughter that escapes before the brain decides whether something is funny or dangerous. Several people in the circle laughed openly. A woman near the bar covered her mouth. The host, standing 15 feet away with a bourbon, grinned the grin of a man watching his party produce a moment that people would talk about on Monday. Second layer, silence. The laughter faded. Something was wrong. The small man beneath the hand hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, hadn't ducked or stepped away or laughed along or done any of the things a person does when a much larger person turns them into furniture. Bruce Lee stood with a glass of water in his left hand and a 275-pound man's palm resting on his skull and did absolutely nothing. Third layer, tension. The absence of reaction became louder than any reaction could have been. 40 people stared at the space between the two men. The tall man's smile held, but behind it, something flickered. A question forming in a place he wasn't used to. Questions forming. His hand was on this man's head. This man wasn't moving. Why wasn't this man moving? 3 seconds passed. Bruce spoke. His voice was quiet, conversational. He did not look up. He'd leave it there. The tall man's smile froze. His fingers, draped across Bruce's temples, twitched once. What? Your hand. Leave it there. One more second of silence. The room held its breath the way a theatre holds its breath when the lights go down and the first note hasn't played yet. Everybody in the room was still. The jazz from the stereo continued. Miles Davis floating over the silence like smoke over a battlefield. Bruce moved. One motion. His right hand traveled upward from his side in an ascending arc. Not a punch, not a slap, not a grab. An open palm strike. His fingers were together, his wrist locked, his palm flat and angled slightly inward. The target was not the tall man's hand, not his wrist, not his elbow. The target was a point on the underside of the tall man's forearm, 3 inches below the elbow, on the lateral side, directly above the spot where the radial nerve passes closest to the surface of the skin. A nerve bundle the width of a pencil, buried under 14 pounds of muscle in a man this size, accessible only to someone who knew exactly where it was and could reach it at a speed that didn't allow the muscle to tense in defense. Nobody in the room saw the hand move. They saw Bruce's right arm at his side. Then they saw it at the tall man's forearm. The space between those two positions was empty. The motion existed in a gap between frames, in the flicker between one moment and the next, in the blind spot of human visual processing. Later, 3 different guests would describe the same experience. They blinked, and the strike had already happened. One man said it was like watching a card trick. You know, something moved, but your eyes refused to report what. The palm made contact. The force was approximately 6 pounds, not 60, not 600, 6. The weight of a bag of flour, the weight of a newborn, applied to a nerve the width of a pencil, at a velocity of roughly 45 miles per hour, in a contact window of 0.008 of a second. The tall man's arm fell. It didn't retract, it didn't pull back, it fell. The way a branch falls from a tree, not because it decided to let go, but because the thing holding it up stopped working. His hand slid off Bruce's head and dropped to his side. His fingers curled inward slightly, frozen in a half grip. His forearm hung from his elbow like a pendulum that had run out of swing. The radial nerve had shut down. The electrical signal from his brain that told his forearm muscles to contract, that told his fingers to extend, that told his wrist to rotate, had been interrupted. Not damaged, not severed, interrupted, like a phone line going dead in a storm. The hardware was intact. The signal wasn't arriving. The tall man stared at his own hand. He tried to move his fingers. They didn't respond. He tried to make a fist. Nothing. He tried to lift his wrist. The wrist hung. He rotated his shoulder. That worked. He bent his elbow. That worked. Everything above the strike point functioned. Everything below it was gone. He stared at his hand, the way a man stares at a clock that has stopped. Not with pain, not with fear, with the deep, disoriented bewilderment of someone whose body has always been his most reliable instrument, and who has just discovered that it has an off switch he didn't know existed. "I can't feel my fingers," he said. His voice was quiet. The baritone that had shaken glassware all night was now barely above a whisper. 20 people heard it. 40 people saw his face. Bruce stepped to the side. He straightened his black silk shirt where the tall man's palm had pressed the fabric against his scalp. He lifted his glass of water from where he'd set it on the windowsill. He took a sip. Calm, unhurried. The way a man takes a sip of water after finishing a sentence in a conversation. He looked up at the tall man. Not with anger, not with triumph, not with the cold satisfaction of a man who has proven a point. With something quieter. The steady, level gaze of a man who has delivered a lesson he didn't want to deliver, but couldn't afford not to. "They'll come back," Bruce said. He paused. 1 second. 2. "Your respect won't leave." 6 seconds after the strike, the tall man's fingers twitched. A small motion. Involuntary. The nerve signal returning the way electricity returns after a power outage. Not all at once, but in surges. First the pinky, then the ring finger, then the middle. He opened and closed his hand 3 times, testing each finger independently, watching them respond with the cautious attention of a man who has just been reminded that the things he takes for granted can be taken away in 8,000ths of a second. He looked at Bruce Lee. The room was silent. The man standing in that living room staring at his own fingers, opening and closing a hand that had refused to obey him for 6 seconds, was not just tall, he was not just an athlete, he was the most physically dominant force in the history of professional basketball. His name was Wilt Chamberlain. The world called him Wilt. Born August 21st, 1936, in Philadelphia, 7 feet, 1 inch tall, 275 pounds in playing condition. Though teammates estimated he was closer to 290 during the off-season, when he spent more time in the weight room. He bench-pressed 500 pounds. He reportedly deadlifted over 600. Arnold Schwarzenegger, who trained at Gold's Gym in Venice Beach during this same era, once said that Wilt Chamberlain was the strongest human being he had ever personally witnessed. And Arnold had stood in rooms with every professional bodybuilder on the planet. In 1962, Wilt scored 100 points in a single basketball game, 100, against the New York Knicks, a record that has stood for over 60 years and will almost certainly stand forever. That same season, he averaged 50.4 points per game, 50 per game, for an entire season. He also averaged 48.5 minutes per game in a sport where games are 48 minutes long, meaning he played every second of regulation and most of overtime for an entire year without sitting down. His vertical leap was measured at 48 inches, 4 feet off the ground. At 275 pounds, his hand span was 11.5 inches. He could palm a basketball the way a normal man palms an orange. This man's arm had just been turned off by a 135-pound martial artist, using an open palm and 6 pounds of force. The party continued around them, but Bruce and Wilt had become an island. Guests gave them space the way pedestrians give space to 2 cars that have just collided, close enough to watch, far enough to not get involved. Wilt sat on the arm of a sofa. Even seated, his eyes were level with Bruce's standing eye line. They were the same height now. For the first time all night, neither man was looking up or down. "What did you do to my arm?" Wilt asked. No anger, genuine curiosity. The curiosity of an elite athlete encountering a physical phenomenon he has never experienced. Bruce explained, radial nerve, 2 to 3 inches below the lateral epicondyle of the elbow. A nerve bundle that controls forearm rotation, finger extension, and wrist movement. Your arm has 14 pounds of muscle protecting it. I didn't hit the muscle, I hit the wire inside the muscle. How much force? About 6 pounds. Wilt looked at his right hand. He made a fist. The fist that had grabbed rebounds over 7-foot opponents, that had palmed basketballs like grapefruits, that had once reportedly bent a steel parking meter in an argument. That fist had been turned off by the weight of a bag of sugar. 6 pounds shut down my arm. 6 pounds in the right place at the right speed. A bullet weighs less than an ounce. Wilt was quiet, then he leaned forward, elbows on knees, and looked at Bruce with an expression that had nothing to do with basketball or parties or the 40 people pretending not to listen. "My whole life," Wilt said, "my size has been my weapon. I walk into a room and I've already won. Nobody challenges the biggest man in the room. Nobody reaches for me first. You're the first person in years who didn't step back when I got close. Stepping back tells your opponent where your fear lives." Bruce said, "I don't give that information away." They talked for 2 hours. The party thinned around them. Guests left in pairs and groups. The jazz shifted from Miles Davis to Bill Evans. The pool light cycled from blue to green. The host refilled drinks and kept his distance. They talked about being reduced to one dimension. Wilt told Bruce, "They see 7 on 1 inch, and they stop thinking. They don't see the footwork. They don't see the timing. They don't see the geometry of how I position a defender 3 seconds before the ball arrives." Bruce told Wilt, "They see Chinese and they stop thinking. They don't see the philosophy. They don't see 20 years of training. They see a stereotype, and they cast me as a sidekick." "We're both living inside someone else's assumption," Wilt said. "The assumption is the first opponent," Bruce said. "The person is the second." Wilt asked Bruce to teach him one thing he could use. Bruce showed him 3 nerve locations that a long-armed man could reach before any attacker got close. Radial nerve on the forearm, brachial plexus on the side of the neck, perineal nerve on the outside of the knee. "You don't need my speed, you have reach. The longest arm in the room doesn't need to hit hard, it needs to hit here." Bruce asked Wilt to teach him one thing. Wilt thought, then positioning. "I score 50 points a game, not because I'm tall. I score 50 because by the time the ball gets to me, I've already moved the defender to the wrong spot. The score is decided before the shot." Bruce stared at him. "That's Jeet Kune Do. That's basketball. Same thing. Different ceiling height." They walked to the foyer together. The height contrast was architectural. Wilt's shoulder was above Bruce's head. They looked like a building walking beside a blade. Wilt opened the front door. The October air poured in, carrying eucalyptus from the canyon. He looked back. "Bruce, one question. When I put my hand on your head, you said leave it there. Why? Why didn't you just step away?" Bruce looked up at him, 18 inches up, the same distance it had always been. But the distance meant something different now, because if I moved, you'd think I was afraid. If I struck while your hand was on me, you'd know I wasn't. Wilt stared at him for 4 seconds, then nodded once. Slowly. "Good night, little man." "Good night, big man." Wilt walked to a purple Bentley parked at the top of the driveway. Bruce walked to a black Porsche at the bottom. 2 doors closed. 2 engines started. They drove in opposite directions down the canyon road into the grid of Los Angeles lights below. Wilt Chamberlain played professional basketball until 1973. He retired as the all-time leading scorer in NBA history with 31,419 points, 13 All-Star selections, 4 MVP awards, 2 championships. He was inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame in 1979. He remained the most physically imposing figure in any room he entered for the rest of his life. He died on October 12, 1999, at age 63. Wilt told many stories over those years. He claimed many things, but there was one story he told rarely, only to close friends, always with the same expression, not humor, not bravado, but a quiet, genuine wonder. The story was about a man at a party who weighed 135 pounds and shut down his entire right arm with an open palm. He always ended it the same way. "I put my hand on his head. He could have moved. He didn't. He wanted me to feel what happened next." Bruce Lee died on July 20th, 1973. He was 32 years old. In his personal notebook, among thousands of entries about technique and philosophy, there is a single line dated October 1969. "The biggest man I've ever touched. 6 pounds. Right nerve. He understood." In the autumn of 1969, a 7'1" man put his hand on a 5'7" man's head in a room full of people. It was the kind of gesture the big man had made 1,000 times. A joke, a claim, a reminder of the hierarchy of size. This time, the small man didn't move, and the big man learned that the room is not measured from the ceiling down. It's measured from the nerve up. 18 inches of height, 140 pounds of weight, 6 pounds of force, 1 nerve, 3 seconds. That was all it took to turn the biggest man in the room into a student.